Okay, today we're going to be talking about Chapter 1, Section 1. Our goals for this section are to define biology, list the 7 characteristics of life, describe those 7 characteristics of life, and summarize the hierarchy of organization found in living things. So our bell work question today was, what is biology? And we said that biology is the study of life. So that encompasses all living things on the planet. These living things can be divided into 3 domains. So the domain bacteria, the domain archaea, and the domain eukarya. And those 3 domains can then be divided into 6 kingdoms. So the domain bacteria has the kingdom bacteria, the domain archaea has the kingdom archaea, and the domain eukarya actually has 4 kingdoms: the protists, plants, fungi, and animals. Homework question number 1. Biology is the study of what? So go ahead and pause the video here if you need to answer the question. Homework question number 2. Which domain do humans belong to? Homework question number 3. Which kingdom do humans belong to? Homework question number 4. What characteristics do you think all life has in common? I want you to list 3. Brainstorm a list. Okay, so there are 7 characteristics of life that biologists identify, and they are listed here. We're going to talk about each one in order. You need to know this list of 7 characteristics of life, and you need to be able to describe each one. The first is cellular organization. Organisms have a high degree of order within their internal and external parts. So what does this mean? So you can see we have an owl here. So this is our organism, and it's made up of different parts. And these parts have different levels to them. So for instance, our organism, the owl, has organs, which are made up of tissues, which are made up of cells, which are made up of organelles, which are made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms. And each of these levels has a very specific structure to it that allows it to function properly. And these different levels are what we refer to as our hierarchy of organization. So our highest level is the organism, the lowest level is the atom. I want you to know this basic order of organization. Homework question number 6. We focus specifically on the organization of cells because A, biology is the study of cells. B, cells are the smallest unit of life. C, there is nothing smaller than a cell. D, there is nothing larger than a cell. Okay, our second characteristic of life is response to stimuli. So what does this mean? Organisms respond to physical and chemical changes in the environment. So, for example, we can look at plants. Plants grow towards light sources. So our light source here is our stimulus, and the plant is responding to that change in the environment by growing towards it. Another example is earthworms. So earthworms like to stay deep in the ground where it's nice and moist so they don't dry out in the sun. If you dig up an earthworm, it's going to respond to that change in its environment and burrow back into the ground. Our third characteristic of life is homeostasis. Organisms maintain a stable level of internal conditions despite changing external conditions. So one example we can look at is blood cells. If blood cells have too much water, they will burst and essentially die. If they have too little water, they will shrivel up and also die. So blood cells want to maintain this normal water level so that they maintain this stable condition and they are able to function properly. Another example we can look at is dogs. So when the heat outside, dogs' body temperature rises. And if a dog gets too hot, it's going to overheat and it might die. So what happens is the dog is going to pant, and as it pants, the moisture evaporates from its tongue, and that cools the dog down. So this is one way that the dog can maintain a stable body temperature, stable internal conditions. The fourth characteristic of life is metabolism. Organisms use energy to power all life processes. So different organisms get energy from different places. Plants get energy from the sun, so they take light energy and convert it into a usable form of energy, which they can then use to power their life processes, such as growing, reproducing, etc. Humans take in chemical energy in the form of food, and then they turn that into a form of energy they can use to power their life processes as well. Homework question number 7. When a shark detects the presence of blood in water, it moves closer to the source of the blood in search of easy prey. This is an example of which characteristic of life? Choose from one of the 7. Homework question number 8. Some forms of bacteria are photosynthetic, meaning they're able to transform the energy from sunlight into a form of energy which they can use to power their life processes. This is an example of which characteristic of life? Again, choose from the 7. Our next characteristic of life is growth and development. Organisms increase in size and undergo structural changes over time. So for example, a tadpole, over its life, grows and develops into an adult frog. Humans also undergo growth and development. So we start off as an embryo, we develop into a baby, and then that baby then develops into an adult. The next characteristic of life is reproduction. Organisms produce offspring. This one's pretty straightforward. So we have 2 penguins here. They reproduce sexually to have this little baby penguin. And then we have a hydra here, which reproduces asexually. So it essentially makes a clone of itself. And you can see that it starts growing this appendage, and eventually that breaks off in what a process we call budding. And then we have 2 organisms that have the same DNA. The last characteristic of life is evolution. Populations of organisms change over time to adapt to their environment. So we're saying that organisms change over time, but it's not individual organisms. So we don't start off with this land mammal here, and throughout its life it turns into a whale. That's not how it works. So it's the population that is evolving. So for instance, over many, many, many generations, we see these changes in the population, and eventually we get a different looking organism. One example of this is also the peppered moths, which we'll talk about later, but you can see that the population can change over time based on its environment. So here the light moths are harder to see, so they survive easier. Here the dark moths are harder to see, so they survive easier. So based on their environment, we can get different populations. Homework question number 9. When humans use large amounts of oxygen while exercising, the increased need for oxygen causes them to, in turn, take deeper and more frequent breaths to make up for the depletion of oxygen in their bodies. This is an example of which characteristic of life? Again, choose from the 7. Homework question number 10. In a population of rabbits, 75% are brown and 25% are white. The population moves to a colder area where snow falls frequently. Over time, white rabbits become the majority in this population because the brown rabbits are easier to spot in the snow and thus have a lower survival rate. This is an example of which characteristic of life? Okay, we've covered all 7 characteristics. Remember to answer those questions and write them down, and they will be turned in tomorrow.